This episode is not a biography. It is an investigation into money, control, and the legal structures wrapped around both. And if you stay with the public record long enough, court pleadings, regulator orders, congressional memoranda, you start to see the same pattern over and over. Assets placed in layers, ownership filtered through entities, and control moved in ways that could make the whole machine harder to read from the outside. I want to be precise here. We are dealing with a record that mixes adjudicated facts, regulator findings, civil allegations, and investigative claims. Those are not the same thing. So throughout this episode, I'm going to separate what was formally charged, what regulators documented, what civil complaints alleged, and what congressional investigators said they found in internal bank records. The core thread is simple, even if the paperwork is not. Jeffrey Epstein's assets appear to have been organized through a network that, according to public filings, obscured direct control. The U.S. Virgin Islands shows up repeatedly, not just as the site of key properties, but as a jurisdiction tied to corporations, aircraft entities, trusts, and financial service vehicles. That matters because when a case becomes only about one infamous individual, the surrounding system can disappear from view. And the system is the story. The estate filings, the Virgin Islands litigation, the New York regulator's consent order against Deutsche Bank, the Senate Finance Committee staff memo on JP Morgan, they do not answer every question. But together, they sketch something larger than a criminal docket. They show infrastructure, property companies, trustees, administrators, banks, wires, cash movement, and delayed oversight. So the question for this episode is not just what Epstein owned. It's how that ownership was arranged, who appeared in control roles, why the Virgin Islands kept surfacing, and what the public record can actually prove. Because scandals fade, structures don't. And if there's a lesson here, it's that opaque wealth can outlast the headlines, unless somebody keeps reading the filings. Start with the obvious question. How did one man build a web this large? By 2019, according to a detention filing in the Southern District of New York, the government described Epstein as having a net worth exceeding $500 million, based on banking records it had obtained. That same filing listed multiple residences in New York, Florida, New Mexico, Paris, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. On paper, that is already a global footprint. But the public record suggests it was not held in a simple, direct way. The most detailed snapshots come later, especially in Virgin Islands litigation. Public reporting on a probate petition there described an estate initially reported as holding hundreds of millions of dollars in Virgin Islands located cash and investments, along with aircraft and global real estate. The litigation narrative also says worldwide property was consolidated into something called the 1953 Trust, shortly before Epstein's death, alongside a pour-over will. That is not just estate housekeeping. If accurate, it's a major clue about control. And this is where, well, the story changes shape. If you only look at the criminal case, you see allegations of trafficking and abuse. If you look at the asset structure, you see a parallel question. How were properties, aircraft, accounts, and service companies arranged, and who had authority over them? The Virgin Islands complaint uses strong language, calling the structure a deliberately complex web of corporations and LLCs used to hold property and move funds. That wording comes from a civil pleading, so treat it as an allegation, not a final judicial finding. But it points us to the right records. Those records include a subpoena defining a wide set of Epstein entities, a regulator order detailing account activity, and congressional memoranda summarizing suspicious activity reporting. For an investigative reporter, this is the part that matters. Not because corporate paperwork is glamorous, it is not, but because structures tell you what the people inside the system thought was worth hiding, separating, or buffering. That's the frame for everything that follows. Let's trace the real estate, because the geography is almost a map of the network itself. The core residences repeatedly referenced in official filings are 9 East 71st Street in Manhattan, 358 El Brio Way in Palm Beach, 49 Zorro Ranch Road in New Mexico, property at 22 Avenue Foch in Paris, and the islands Little St. James and Great St. James in the U.S. Virgin Islands. What stands out is the holding structure. Virgin Islands pleadings say that in a wave around 2011 and 2012, major properties were shifted into U.S. Virgin Islands corporations. Maple Inc. is described as holding the Manhattan townhouse as of late December 2011. Laurel Inc. is described as holding the Palm Beach property around the same time. Cypress Inc. is linked in the pleadings to Zorro Ranch, also through a transfer around December 2011. For Little St. James, the pleadings describe a transfer on December 30th, 2011, from a Delaware entity, LSJ LLC, to Nautilus Inc., a Virgin Islands corporation, for $10 and other consideration. The deed narrative reportedly listed Epstein as the sole member of the Delaware LLC. Then there is Great St. James. According to the pleadings, Great St. Jim LLC was organized in October 2015 and acquired parcels in January 2016. Another entity, Poplar Inc., is described as supporting permitting and signatory functions related to that island project. So the pattern is not one company per asset, neat and clean. It's more layered than that. Property holder here, support entity there, signatories somewhere else. Later, many of those assets were sold. Reuters reported the Manhattan mansion sold in 2021 for about $51 million. The Palm Beach house sold that same year for $18.5 million and was later demolished. Reporting says the Paris property sold in 2022 for around 10 million euros. Forbes reported the two islands sold together in 2023 for $60 million. Zorro Ranch was also reported sold in 2023, though the price was not disclosed in the business press cited here. So why does this matter? Because the public record does not just show luxury property. It shows a migration of title into Virgin Islands corporations, especially in that 2011-2012 period. That suggests the real estate was part of a broader administrative design, not just a collection of homes. Now we get to the part that feels almost engineered to blur the edges: the trusts and the administrators. The central names in the public record are the 1953 Trust, Southern Trust Company, Southern Financial, and the Butterfly Trust. Each shows up in a different way, but together they suggest a network built not only to hold assets, but to route authority. Virgin Islands pleadings say the 1953 Trust became the central post-death holding structure after Epstein amended and restated the trust and executed a pour-over will 2 days before his death. Again, that comes from litigation, so it should be treated as the government's allegation in that civil case. But if true, it means the trust became the main container for worldwide property at a critical moment. Southern Trust Company is even more concrete in the filings. The pleadings say it was incorporated in November 2011 as Financial Informatics, then renamed in 2012. They describe Epstein as president and director for years, with Richard Kahn as treasurer and director, Darren Indyke as secretary and director, and pleadings even characterize Epstein as the sole owner. The same filings say the company reported assets of $198.5 million in 2013, and later $391.3 million. Southern Financial, registered in 2013, is less fully described in the pleadings excerpt, but it appears in the Deutsche Bank consent order as an account-holding entity. Then there is the Butterfly Trust. New York's financial regulator said Deutsche Bank opened accounts for it in January 2014, and that beneficiaries included people labeled in the order as co-conspirators 1 through 3, along with others. The regulator said those trust accounts were used to send more than 120 wires, totaling $2.65 million to beneficiaries. As for the administrators, the Virgin Islands complaint puts Indyke and Kahn at the center. It alleges they served as co-executors or trust administrators while also acting as officers, directors, or signatories across multiple entities and accounts. Larry Visosky, Epstein's pilot, appears in the pleadings as manager or member in aircraft-related entities, including Plan D and Hyperion Air. None of that alone proves wrongdoing by any individual, but it does show concentration, a relatively small group appearing repeatedly at the control points of a much larger network. And that may be the key insight. Ownership can be hidden. Control leaves fingerprints in signatures, officer roles, annual reports, account authority, and who shows up over and over again. The banking record is where the structure becomes measurable. Not complete, far from it, but measurable. Two sources dominate here: a 2020 consent order from the New York State Department of Financial Services covering Deutsche Bank, and a 2025 Senate Finance Committee staff memorandum about JP Morgan's suspicious activity reporting. The Deutsche Bank order says the relationship officially began in August 2013, when the bank opened brokerage accounts for Southern Trust Company and Southern Financial. Over time, according to the order, Epstein, related entities, and associates opened and funded more than 40 accounts. The same order says Deutsche Bank opened accounts for the Butterfly Trust in January 2014. It reports more than 120 wires totaling $2.65 million to trust beneficiaries, including alleged co-conspirators and others, with transfers described as covering hotel, tuition, and rent. The order also describes a cash pattern. Over 2013 to 2017, it says there were repeated withdrawals through an attorney using a third-party withdrawal limit of $7,500, totaling more than $800,000. The regulator described inquiries about how often withdrawals could be made without triggering alerts and discussed structuring risk. It also noted Deutsche Bank filed currency transaction reports when required. That distinction matters. The regulator documented suspicious patterns and compliance failures. It did not make final conclusions here about the ultimate criminal purpose of every withdrawal. The Senate staff memo on JP Morgan makes a different claim, that between 2002 and 2016, the bank filed only a small number of suspicious activity reports, flagging about $4.3 million in transactions. Then, after Epstein's 2019 arrest, filed much broader reports, flagging more than 5,000 wire transfers, totaling roughly $1.3 billion. The memo also says senior executives closely supervise the relationship and includes specific transactional assertions, including payments to Ghislaine Maxwell and large cash withdrawals during periods with no SAR filings. Here's the line we need to hold. A regulator order establishes documented compliance failures at Deutsche Bank. A Senate investigative memo alleges underreporting and delayed escalation at JP Morgan based on internal records and unsealed materials. Those are serious findings, but they are not the same as a court judgment establishing intent by every bank employee or executive named in the record. Still, they show something vital. The financial system saw red flags late, incompletely, or both. If one jurisdiction keeps reappearing in this story, it's the U.S. Virgin Islands. Not incidentally, structurally. The Virgin Islands show up as the site of Little St. James and Great St. James, the place where probate and civil enforcement unfolded, the incorporation home for multiple holding companies, and the location of entities tied to aviation, trust administration, and financial services. The Virgin Islands pleadings also provide some of the clearest estate snapshots in the public record. According to the complaint's description of the 2019 probate filing, the estate was initially reported as holding $577,672,654 in Virgin Islands located assets, including cash, fixed income, and equities, hedge fund and private equity investments, and planes, boats, and automobiles. The same litigation says corporate shares held the major residences in New York, New Mexico, Palm Beach, Paris, and the islands. That matters because it places the territory at the center of both legal control and financial presentation. The Virgin Islands was not just where some property happened to be. It appears to have been a jurisdiction through which property, companies, and incentives were organized. The civil complaint goes further, alleging misuse of economic development incentives and concealment mechanisms. Those are allegations, and they remain allegations unless proved. But they explain why the local government pursued the case so aggressively. That pressure led to major civil outcomes. The Virgin Islands Department of Justice announced a settlement with the Epstein estate, requiring payment of $105 million, along with the return of more than $80 million in economic development benefits. Separate public reporting and settlement materials also point to the territory as a battleground in disputes, over who benefited from the enterprise and who should repay those gains. There was also a 2023 settlement with Leon Black that, in its recitals, said public reports indicated he paid $158 million over about 5 years to Southern Trust, while the agreement itself included non-admission language and a $62.5 million payment to the Virgin Islands government. So the Virgin Islands became two things at once: the apparent hub of a dense corporate network and the legal arena where that network was most directly challenged. Sometimes a place is just a backdrop. Here, it looks more like the switchboard. By this point, the temptation is to connect every dot into one finished picture. But good reporting resists that urge. The public record is strong in some places and thin in others. Here's what is solid. Federal charging documents in 2019 allege sex trafficking conspiracy and sex trafficking conduct between at least 2002 and 2005 in New York and Florida. The SDNY detention filing described a net worth above $500 million and multiple residences. The New York regulator's order documented Deutsche Bank compliance failures, more than 40 accounts, more than 120 wires from the Butterfly Trust, totaling $2.65 million, and cash withdrawal patterns that raised structuring concerns. Virgin Islands pleadings identified specific entities, dates, officer roles, and property transfer narratives that are concrete enough to test against deeds and annual reports. The estate and later settlements are also matters of record. What remains less certain? Intent, for one. Civil pleadings allege concealment, asset shielding, misuse of nonprofit structures, and strategic transfer of control. Those are detailed allegations, sometimes very detailed, but still allegations unless independently confirmed or adjudicated. The Senate staff memo on J.P. Morgan is a valuable investigative artifact, but it is still a memorandum, not a verdict. Public summaries of SAR activity tell us what investigators say the bank eventually flagged. They do not give us a complete transactional ledger. There are open questions the record leaves hanging. Were the 2011-2012 transfers mainly tax, privacy, estate, or liability planning, or some blend of all four? What do the underlying deed packets, signatory cards, and annual reports show when lined up side by side? How much authority did named administrators exercise in practice, not just on paper? And how much more would become visible if the unsealed exhibits referenced by Senate investigators were reviewed in full? That's a terrible analogy. Let me try again. Think of the public record as an X-ray, not a full-body scan. You can see the frame, you can see fractures, you can even see where pressure was concentrated. But not every tissue, not every motive, not every conversation. Still, one conclusion feels unavoidable. This case is about more than one person. It is also about hidden systems. Trusts, shell companies, signatories, banks, incentives, jurisdictions that can distribute control while obscuring ownership. And once you see that, it becomes very hard to call this just a scandal. It looks more like an infrastructure failure with names attached. So the lesson here goes beyond Epstein himself. Opaque wealth often survives by becoming administrative, split across entities, moved through trusts, buffered by professional roles, and processed by institutions that may see fragments instead of the whole. The public record exposed a lot. It did not expose everything. What we have are patterns. A property network shifted into Virgin Islands companies, trust structures positioned near the end of life, administrators appearing across multiple control points, and banks later criticized for failures in monitoring or reporting. What we do not have, at least not yet in public, is every beneficial owner document, every deed packet, every bank exhibit, every private instruction. But accountability does not depend on perfect knowledge. It depends on whether institutions learn from what is already visible. Because the systems around a scandal can persist long after the scandal breaks. And if those systems remain opaque, the next case won't look like an exception. It'll look like a template. I'm Daniel Palmer. This has been Lumen Publicum. We'll keep following the records, and we'll keep separating what can be proved from what is only claimed. Talk soon.